Hello and welcome to EpicurusZ. Today we'll be going through a presentation that I put together over the last few months that I titled Roadmap to the Future of World War Part 1. I expect to keep adding to this as more develops, especially with this Iran situation and some of the stuff going on with China. But my goal for this presentation is basically I have the idea that there is going to be another world conflict. It's inevitable, it will happen. So I'm going to do my best to try and look at what's going on right now in the world and kind of put together possible scenarios, who could be involved, who are the actors, and kind of what scenarios could develop that would cause a world conflict. Now, in this presentation, specifically in part 1, I'm going to be discussing terrorism. I'm going to be defining some basic terms that we're going to be using as we go through. So I'm just going to try to standardize the language, kind of. And then we're also going to talk about the U.S. military, what they're currently doing right now, what their future goals seem to be, what their past goals seem to have been, and kind of what does it look like America thinks the threat is. So without further ado, here we go. It's the Roadmap to the Future of World War, Part 1. So what could start it? Some possibilities that I see are either, so there's going to be 3 different ways it happens. You have state-to-state conflict, non-state actor to state actor, or a rapid destabilization of an entire region. Now these are 3 pretty basic things. I'm going to get into them in more detail pretty soon. But basically the reason I chose these 3 is because they're the most general. And so state-to-state is, most wars have been fought that way. Non-state actor to state actor is a relatively recent phenomenon, and again, we'll get into what those words mean right now. And then rapid destabilization of an entire region is also a possibility, as has usually been the case in sort of conflicts. So what is state-to-state? State-to-state is a very direct conflict arising from trade, resources, land, etc., and it means that 2 states confronting each other directly, as in at first, what is a state? A centralized government with a centralized military, a centralized currency, its own financial system, etc. An example of this is, America, or I guess the United States of America, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the list goes on. So a state-to-state conflict would be 2 states fighting each other directly. So if that were America fighting China, that would be US military troops fighting the People's Liberation Army of China, so PLA, directly. Some examples of regions or scenarios that could start a world conflict are the South China Sea. And what's going on there is China claims it's theirs. The U.S. claims, I'm pretty sure it's international waters, and they've kind of been flexing their muscles militarily, flying by each other, running drills in the same areas, that sort of thing. The EU destabilizing after Brexit, I don't necessarily think that this could lead to a full-on world war. It could be like one of the dominoes to fall much before. But what I see it as more is it's a way of increasing tension on the world stage. Because with the UK leaving the EU, the European Union, we could see a very rapid economic and fracturing of the European Union, and that's because the UK was one of its largest economies, and now you only have Germany and France, and there already have been movements. France with Le Pen, I think Italy has had some of their own leave campaigns. Poland is seeing a very large right-wing revival, and so there's a lot of examples in which the EU could rapidly start to destabilize right now. Another example is Turkey and Syria fighting. We're allied with Turkey. Turkey is a part of NATO. Syria is allied with Russia and is seeking active military help from Russia. So if the 2 kind of come into conflict, that could be very bad. That could draw a lot of other countries in. Iran directly attacking an American base, which definitely did just happen. And that's another example of a state fighting another state directly versus historically how Iran has fought America indirectly, which we'll get into later in this presentation. And another one is North Korea attack on South Korea. I see this is unlikely, but it is still a very real possibility given whatever circumstances come out of the current attempt by the Trump administration to denuclearize and what obviously Kim Jong-un's reaction to that will be. So next we move on to non-state actor versus state actor, and what this is a non-direct confrontation arising from terrorism or other things. Good examples of this are Hezbollah launching an attack on Israel. Now, Hezbollah is a terrorist group located in Lebanon, which shares the northern border with Israel, and so they're also funded by the Iranians. So if Hezbollah launches an attack on Israel, let's say they shoot missiles at Tel Aviv, that would in essence be Iran attacking Israel, but technically it would be Hezbollah attacking Israel. So that's Hezbollah is a non-state actor because they don't have their own currency, they don't have their own centralized military, they don't have strict national borders, they're not a state. Other examples of this are Al-Qaeda, specifically with 9/11. So the 9/11 attack was, at least from what I've studied about the attack, was funded by the Saudi Arabians. I'm pretty sure that has come out pretty recently in some declassified documents that the Saudi Arabians were behind it. So that again is an example of a non-state actor who is funded by a state actor nonetheless, but a non-state actor attacking a state actor. And most non-state actors are funded by state actors. So, for example, Iran is a large source of many Shia Islamic terrorist groups. So they fund a lot of terror networks, and these terror networks are used to attack the United States and their allies. We come to our third example, which is rapid destabilization of an entire region. A destabilization of an entire region could lead to a cash grab for resources. Similarities to this are the colonization in Africa and South America around the same time I think it was the early 1800s, but also the slave trade from before. A destabilization of an entire region could easily lead to bigger, power-hungry countries coming in and trying to divvy up the resources. We saw this in the Middle East. We're still seeing this in the Middle East. Modern day regions could be the EU after Brexit. Now, I'm not saying that there would be some sort of a cash grab, but Russia has been asserting dominance not just in the EU or to its neighbors, to the EU's neighbors, but also in the Middle East. So we could see that if there seems to be a fracturing of the EU, Putin might step in and try to take some of the smaller eastern states back into Russia's orbit. Or again in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Syria is still ongoing. We saw rapid destabilization of that entire region, and it's drawn in a lot of major players on the world stage who have come very close to direct confrontation with each other. We've seen this with Russia's helping of the Assad government and America's aid to rebel groups who are anti-Assad and anti-ISIS, and also America's direct fighting to ISIS. So there's a lot of different players going on here in the northeastern, and with the Kurds, you have Turkey with Erdogan, and then Assad with Syria. So there's been a lot of conflict over that region. And one that I don't have listed here is the Kashmir, and that is in northeastern to the northeast of India. Both of it is claimed, I'm fairly certain, by Pakistan and by India, so there's a lot of conflict that comes in that area. And then Iraq, because we invaded, Afghanistan because of the I think it was in the 80s of the Russians invading the country, and the United States funding the Mujahideen fighters. Libya with Gaddafi. So all of these are examples. So the significance of this is all of these are examples of entire regions being destabilized, bigger countries coming in, trying to get the situation to work for them and benefit them, and then that leads to a lot of conflict. So what is most likely to cause a world war in 2020 or in the next 10, 15 years? Well, to start, we have to define what a world war is. I have a very basic definition. It's a conflict that causes the world's superpowers to fight each other directly. However, a modern world war could include or involve proxies for conflict. The two world wars that have happened so far, World Wars I and II, involved direct state-to-state conflict. So, for example, in World War I, you had the Japanese state fighting the United States, or the USSR, or not, sorry, the USSR fighting Nazi Germany. So those are all state-to-state conflicts. And a good example of kind of a world war that isn't classified as a world war is the Cold War. I would consider it a world war because it did involve many of the nations, or almost all of the nations present, because you had guerrilla wars in numerous different regions in South America. You had Vietnam, you had the Korean War, you had the eastern and western parts of Germany and Berlin. Like, there's a lot of tension and conflict, and pretty much everyone in the world was involved in some way. So what I think is most likely to cause world war nowadays would be terrorism. Because it doesn't involve a direct confrontation between two state actors, like we're going to talk about further with Iran versus the United States. How does Iran fight the United States without formally attacking it? It can also rapidly become a collection of proxy wars in different regions. We see this with the Cold War. It has already led to complete destabilization of entire regions, such as the Middle East. And it's the hardest form of enemy to fight using traditional state means. Look to the war on terrorism. George W. Bush declared the war on terror, and yet there's still terrorism. And we've spent trillions of dollars trying to fight terrorism. But you can't fight an enemy that doesn't reside within national borders, because that's not what our military is designed to do. So we have a lot of difficulty accomplishing that. So let's give some general context on terrorism before we really get into the nuts and bolts of it. So why is terrorism important when discussing potential future conflicts? Many countries claim to be uninvolved in global affairs while actively sponsoring terrorism globally. So an example of this would be Iran, and this is from the Brookings Institute, and it's a little bit out of date now because they have actually attacked formally U.S. bases, although we will analyze that later in this presentation. So according to the Brookings Institute, Iran instead uses terrorism as a way to deter Washington. Terrorists give Tehran a way to strike at the United States in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. So without having to pit the Iranian Revolutionary Guard directly against, or I guess it would be the Quds Force. I don't know the name of the Iranian. I'll just say Iranian military. It would, instead of deploying the Iranian military and launching a ground invasion of U.S. troops, let's say in Iraq, that what they do is they fund terrorist groups to do that same work, but kind of with a sense of a sense of detachment almost of it. Like they're not doing it. Oh no, it's just Hezbollah who's doing it, even though everyone knows they get their money from Iran. And examples where terrorism has caused world conflict is, I would say, the September 11th attacks were used to justify military action in the Middle East. And again, this wasn't just America going in; it was a coalition of forces. So it was almost, in a sense, a world war. Sorry, it was in a sense a world war because you had multiple different powerful nations going in, and then basically funding proxy wars. You had Iran funding proxy wars. You had obviously Saddam Hussein and the Saudi Arabians. So a lot of different actors all involved in one region. And this was all because of terrorism. And then right now you see it in Syria, where ISIS has been used as a tool for new action in the Middle East. Obviously, we have fought ISIS, and according to the president, we have defeated ISIS. That remains to be seen, obviously. But ISIS is not the only reason we are in the Middle East. We are protecting oil in northeastern Syria is the most recent example, and you really you can go back through the history and see that terrorism has been used as a justification to be in the region rather than the sole goal of any operation. So some more general context. Radical Islamic terrorism is the most prominent form of terrorism worldwide. Examples of this include ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Currently and in the past, American military forces and allies have engaged in combat operations against these groups, and terrorist groups often receive funding from state actors, even though they are non-state actors. So it's a way to cause tension and to assert power in a region without actually having to get in there yourself. So I think because this seems to be the way that geopolitics has been shifting, at least in the last 30 years, and even more in the last 10 or 5, I think that this is the most likely scenario to cause a lot of different world actors to kind of get pulled into a conflict that they were funding passively. So the current countries that are designated by the U.S. to be state sponsors of terrorism, this is the most recent, as of a few months ago, is when I found this, and that is Sudan, Syria, North Korea, and Iran. We will talk about Sudan, Syria, and Iran. We're not going to talk about North Korea, just because I think that North Korea, while it has the potential to be a very bad scenario, like as in very destructive war. If for some reason there is a war, I don't think it will bring in the big players because Russia doesn't obviously send them anything anymore. They cut off aid. China is starting to get very upset with having North Korea on its border, and it's kind of sick of having to help prop it up, and it's sick of having to deal with it. And South Korea and America have seemed to make it a very strong goal, especially of this administration, in denuclearizing the region. So if this does kick off a war of some sorts, I think it will be North Korea versus the world. I don't think China is going to step in militarily to back it up. They don't want to deal with the problem either. So these countries are significant in any discussion about future conflict, as they are active targets of U.S. military operations. I don't know about Sudan. I don't think formally it is anymore, although I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that. But Syria, North Korea, and Iran certainly are. So we're going to get into those right now. So sponsors of terror, Sudan. Now, they're not a focal point of this discussion. I don't think that Sudan is the place that any sort of world conflict will emerge. I think, though, it's a good example of what a typical terrorist it's a good example of what terrorism can do to a region. So once we get into Iran, and Syria, which do actually have the potential, this gives us a good rough understanding of any sort of terrorist conflict. So the Clinton administration designation, as in they designated it as a state sponsor of terror, was further justified by the use of Sudan as a gathering point for several terrorist groups, including Osama bin Laden's nascent al-Qaeda, thanks to the welcome extended in the mid-1990s by Hassan al-Turabi, who was Speaker of the National Assembly and Secretary General of the National Islamic Front during the period. But al-Turabi lost his government posts after falling out with the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir in 1999, and was even repeatedly in and out of prison until his death earlier this year. And the State Department report notes without qualification that Sudan's support to al-Qaeda has ceased. So as of now, they are not state sponsors of terror, as in they're not actively funding, but they're a good example of what it looks like when you have a state actor funding non-state actors. So the, Hassan al-Turabi, the Speaker of the National Assembly, extended a welcome to terrorist groups, and I'm sure that they were able to train, procure funding, procure missiles, arms, or volunteers even. And so this is an example of how a state can advance its own interests or interests of its allies through passive means. In terms of Sudan is not formally going to engage with any other state militarily. They're just going to use terrorism and terrorist groups to accomplish that goal. So now we move on to Syria as a state sponsor of terror. The ongoing civil war between Assad and rebel groups, some of which were backed by the U.S., has really drawn in a lot of other world players into the scene. Like I was saying, if you look up here, I'm going to use my mouse as a pointer. So Turkey is here, Iraq is here, Jordan is here, Saudi Arabia is here, Israel is right here, and Lebanon is right here. So in Syria, you've got the Kurdish region, which to my knowledge extends up to here, and I think it kind of encompasses this whole area. And there's a lot of oil up here as well. And so what you have is U.S. troops stationed here. You've had Assad, I think, controls a lot of this region and has taken it back once ISIS has been defeated. You have Russia doing joint training exercises with Syria. And so what this means is we have a lot of different actors kind of all getting into the same region, and eventually heads will have to hit each other. And we've already seen this with, I think it was Turkey shot down a Russian jet. And we get into very dicey territory once that starts happening, because then everybody has to everyone has to defend their allies, and you have a very similar situation to what happened in World War I. Rebels in southern Syria have received support, including arms, from Assad's foreign foes during the seven-year-long war. But analysts believe the aid is dropped off after the U.S. President, Donald Trump, shut down a program run by the CIA last year. Excuse me. That's from The Guardian. So America has been funding passively and training rebel groups in Syria. And supposedly it's to fight ISIS, but they also have been anti-Assad groups. So you have you have America doing funding non-state actors to accomplish its foreign policy goals, and you have Russia doing funding an actual state actor to accomplish its foreign policy goals. Turkey that fits in the equation, you have Iraq that fits into the equation, you have Israel that fits into the equation as well. But that could be an entire video in and of itself, and I might make one, honestly, so let me know if you want me to. And so Syria right now is a very likely region that could lead to some sort of formal confrontation between two major world powers, two major states, because of all the reasons I went over, and because it seems almost everyone is too close for comfort in any sort of international relations sense. So next, we're going to talk about the U.S. military actions. We're going to need some context in order to understand the analysis of our final state, Iran. So let's just get into it right away. So where is the U.S. military worldwide right now? So as you can see, the U.S. has a very, very heavy presence in Italy, where you see that large circle kind of encompassing all of Europe. To my knowledge, the main base of operations for the U.S. and Europe has been in Hamburg, Germany, but it was recently moved to Sicily, which is the small island, would be right here. So this island right here that Italy is kind of kicking, I'm pretty sure that is where the current U.S. military base is, and the reason for that was to better combat terrorism in North Africa and the Middle East. So if we've seen what we see now is the reason it was positioned in Hamburg before was because of NATO and because of having to defend against the USSR. Now that's no longer the threat perceived by the American military apparatus. What they see as a threat is the Middle East and Northern Africa. And so again, this is where Syria fits in the equation, and later on you'll see how Iran fits in the situation. Another one we're going to talk about is Camp Lemonnier. I think I pronounced that right, and that is in Djibouti. That would be right here. And the reason that is significant is because if you see, you have the Red Sea right here, and then the Persian Gulf right here. Iran would be right there. Syria is right here. Saudi Arabia is right here. And so a lot of trade goes through the Suez Canal, which runs right here. The Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt is here, and it kind of runs right in between the two. So this, you have a lot of trade coming from Europe and Northern Africa, moving down and moving up. And then you also have the Red Sea, which is obviously kind of the sea that gets kind of connects the Indian Ocean with the Atlantic Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea. So this base in Djibouti is very important. We'll go into a little bit more detail why. If you might already know if you read the news a lot. So here we go. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. Here's a map of the current base and of Djibouti. And currently, a Chinese military base is actually being built very close by. And this is from CNN. In 2017, China's People Liberation Army, the PLA, opened its first overseas base in Djibouti. Its first overseas base. The sprawling gray concrete complex sits on a prime location next to one of Djibouti's main ports, and is just a 15-minute drive from the U.S. military's only permanent base on the continent, Camp Lemonnier. This is very significant. The U.S. has one base on Africa. And where does China decide to build their first ever overseas base? Right next door. This is very bold, it's very calculated, and it's evidence that China is wanting to assert itself in this major trading area. Now, a reason that they might want to be in this location specifically is because of Iran. And the U.S. military presence in terms of trying to combat Iran's influence and expansion. China buys a lot of its oil. I think the number is either 88% of the oil China receives is from Iran, or 88% of Iranian oil is sold to China. I'm not sure which it is, but either way, it's a very significant amount of oil from Iran goes to China. And so if China were to lose access to that oil, let's say Iran completely destabilizes and America moves in, there's some sort of coup and America kind of moves in like they did before and installs a leader, that leader is most definitely not going to be friendly to China. So this is very significant. So let's zoom in a little bit and be specifically in the Middle East, just for reference. Red Sea, Suez Canal, Mediterranean Sea, you have Egypt here, and then Djibouti would be right around here, and then this is Saudi Arabia. So the countries that the Middle East, that the U.S. has presence in, is going to be Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. And the significance of this is I want you to like really focus on the geography of where all of these are in relation to other major players in the region. Now remember what I said. So you have Saudi Arabia here, taking up most of the Arabian Peninsula. We have a lot of military bases right next to Saudi Arabia, or even in Saudi Arabia, or now we do actually, I think, because Trump did send troops over there, but this map, I guess, was made before that. It was relatively recent, so that's not surprising. Anyway, we have Israel here, and then Syria is right here. This whole region right here with access to the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf is Iran. So we're allied with Saudi Arabia, we're allied with Israel. We're obviously not planning on invading Saudi Arabia anytime soon, or any of the other countries where our troops are stationed. What we are focused on is containing Iran, and you'll see why in a little bit. It's going to get clearer and clearer and clearer. I'm just trying to make this as gradual as possible because there's so much to cover. So this next map I'm showing is kind of a zoomed out view, but it shows a lot more of the military bases and air bases and whatnot where the U.S. currently is stationed and deployed. So I want you to notice again the geography of these bases, and I drew these lines on it to kind of illustrate the wall, no pun intended, that the U.S. military is built around a specific region in the Middle East, and this region is Iran. So you can clearly see here there is kind of this almost, and there are actually troops stationed in Iraq. It didn't show up. I guess these are just more major bases. I'm not sure. But even if this is not the extent of the American military presence in Iran, but it is very clear that there is a clear line being drawn around a certain country. Now remember, you have Russia right here and to the north. So the reason that there's not a lot of other bases here is because most of these countries are friendly to Russia. I'm sure Russia has military bases here as well. I could actually look that up and do another video on that as well. But again, there seems to be a wall of U.S. military presence around Iran, trying to contain Iran. So the U.S. in the Middle East, the stars represent countries that the U.S. is either allied with or have a major presence in. This is not extensive, but it's meant to illustrate just who does not have a star. And the two that stand out to me are going to be Iran and Pakistan. Pakistan is significant. I'm fairly certain they have nuclear weapons. They were housing Osama bin Laden, but they have not been in the news as much. I actually am interested, now that I've thought of it. I might actually do a whole video on Pakistan and just try to see what's been going on with them in the last few years. But Iran is the main focus of this. So if you look, for instance, I have Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Djibouti, Afghanistan, all of these different countries that we have either invaded, we either are allied with, or we have major U.S. troops stationed there. And the one that doesn't is Iran. We seem to be doing some sort of a containment policy similar to how we combated the Iron Wall during the Cold War against the USSR. We kind of built, with NATO, in some places a physical wall, not that we built it, but with the Berlin Wall, but we built a metaphorical wall of U.S. military presence and of NATO presence to try to contain the USSR's expansionist habits, I guess you could say. So we've done the same thing with Iran. And so this means there's momentum behind the perceived threat of Iran. So any pundit or anyone who claims that Trump has avoided war, that Trump has de-escalated, while that might be true in the short term, nobody really knows. Because there seems to be so much momentum building up over the last 30 years with all of this military action going on in the Middle East, that a conflict with Iran is almost inevitable at this point. But we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So obviously the question is the U.S. poised to confront Iran? Not necessarily, but the momentum over the past 30 years has been steadily rising, and again, you saw that from the map I just showed. The current conflict with Iran is worrisome, obviously, but Trump has shown restraint. But is that restraint enough? We'll have to see. And again, we've just seen, in response to Trump's killing of General Soleimani, arguably the number 2 man in Iran in terms of power, and also the kind of the right-hand man of the Iranian regime in funding terrorism. He was the one who would go around the Middle East and fund and provide support for terrorist groups. So that's kind of how they use their non-state actors to kind of fight the state actor of the United States. So this is just kind of a new snippet that I found from the New York Times. The first of several Iranian missiles to hit the American military base rammed into the airstrip, nearly destroying a guard tower where 2 young Army specialists were on watch duty. Another crashed next to a dining hall and destroyed part of a building where some drone operators were still working. So this changes the calculus a little bit of the equation, because all of a sudden now you have Iran directly confronting the United States militarily. So it's Iranian troops firing on U.S. troops. It's not Hezbollah doing it. It's not ISIS doing it. It is the Iranian government itself directly sanctioning an attack. So this all started obviously with General Soleimani, although it's been going on for a lot longer. If you do some research into the Iranian deal, or Iran deal, there's a lot of context there. I can go over that in another video if there's demand. But anyway, so this current conflict, or this current kind of heat wave in the region was triggered by the killing of General Soleimani. So since his killing in a U.S. drone strike last week, experts have been rushing to explain just why Soleimani mattered so much to Iran's ambitions, and what consequences his death really holds for the region. One simple way to think about it: he was the one man who had mastered the new landscape of the Middle East. And this means, and actually I won't explain because it gets into it right now. Soleimani's particular skill was in controlling what's known as the non-state actors, there's that term, a dry name that, in the Middle East, covers the fractious group of militias, religious groups, and tribal forces that actually wield power in much of the region. These groups have grown vastly in importance in the past 20 years, confounding traditional diplomats and statecraft, and Soleimani not only exploited but empowered them in Iran's interests. His absence might help the U.S. in the short term, but it also shows just how deep a challenge the region will pose in the near future, and why our adversaries, whether Iran or Russia, still enjoy a significant and unpredictable advantage in exerting power. And this is by Politico, and the link is right there. So this is, like, to basically summarize this, Soleimani was, like I was saying, the hitman kind of the Iranian regime. He would go around and kind of give support to Shia groups, and you even see this in Yemen with the Houthis. I don't know how to Houthis. I'll say because it's Houthi militia groups. With you see with ISIS, and you also see with Hezbollah and Hamas, arguably. So again, this was a very bold move by America, and it led to on the surface bold move from Iran directly attacking a U.S. military base. So the Iranian missile attack, here's a map that I found, and this is the Al-Assad Air Base, so is right here, and Iran is right here. So what they did is they fired missiles into here, so just so you know where it happened. But is it proof of escalation? Not necessarily. This is from the BBC. U.S. and European government sources told Reuters news agency that they believe the Iranians had deliberately sought to minimize casualties and avoid hitting U.S. facilities in order to prevent the crisis escalating out of control, while still signaling their resolve. And their resolve is two things. It's their resolve on the world stage, but it's also their resolve to the people. There have been a lot of protests. There's a stampede during the funeral for General Soleimani. There was massive protests either today or yesterday, and I think they've been ongoing, and police have shot the protesters. There's been internet blackouts and whatnot going on for the last few months. So the Iranian regime needs to show its people that it means business, that it is serious, and that it is capable. No better way to do this from their eyes than attacking the U.S. directly. But if these U.S. And European government sources turn out to be correct, then it kind of was a way of saving face while admitting they couldn't really do anything. Trump kind of, what he did was he went all in. He put all of his chips on the table. And he said, I'm going to basically kill your top general. What are you going to do? In the Irans, they threatened fire and fury. They said, oh, it's going to be the end of the world. We're going to, bring the great Satan of America down. And what they did was they shot off a few rockets. Not even a single U.S. soldier was really injured in any of this. No deaths, thankfully. So the crisis seems to be right now at kind of a stalemate. I would say that the ball is still in Iran's court, although now Trump has a lot of pressure putting on it. If they wait any longer, I kind of see an Iran deal 2.0 being a very strong possibility. I saw in the news today that a lot of European nations are now coming out and who were part of it. I think it was the E3, which is the UK, Germany, and France, the three biggest powers in Europe, all formally acknowledged and condemned Iran and their actions of violating the Iran deal. So now that we're starting to see, what we're starting to see is now America is kind of leading in a lot of its allies into a direct conflict with Iran. You have Canada and I think Australia now kind of being drawn into the fray with this, with the Ukrainian airline being shot down. We will wait for their responses, but the ball is kind of in Iran's court now. They have to make a move. I think they know they have to make a move because obviously this missile attack wasn't really doing anything to kind of assert their dominance. So at Real Donald Trump, Donald Trump's personal Twitter account, he tweeted out, I think it was a few days ago, the government of Iran must allow human rights groups to monitor and report facts from the ground on the ongoing protests by the Iranian people. There cannot be another massacre of peaceful protesters, nor an internet shutdown. The world is watching. And I think he originally tweeted this in Farsi, which is the native tongue of Iran. So what does this show? I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal relatively recently. I think it was either yesterday or 2 days ago about Secretary of Defense. I think his name is Mark Esper, E-S-P-E-R, I'm pretty sure. And it basically was, the article was going over his strategy for the Middle East and how it's changed from a direct military conflict with Iran to more of what Donald Trump has been saying. And it seems that what this shift is the administration is trying to focus on the fact that the Iranian regime is unstable and just kind of wait it out. Because they showed they can't do anything against the United States militarily, so the United States can play the long game and just kind of wait for the entire system to crumble under its own weight and then move in. So this seems to be kind of what the current policy of, although this policy is changing very drastically, so who knows how long this will be the policy for this current administration. But the most important thing to take away is that only time will tell what conflict potential there is. We'll have to wait and see. And the U.S. specifically is going to be waiting for Russian and Chinese responses. I haven't seen any in the news, but I'll be keeping you guys updated if I find anything. Because Russia is vying for control of the Middle East. We've already gotten into that. And China buys a majority of oil from Iran. Again, I think I already got into that at the very beginning of this presentation. But both of these nations have a vested interest in Iran, because let's say Iran becomes all of a sudden a new ally for America after a coup, the U.S. helps install a new leader, etc., and all of a sudden Iran, which you'll see is very centrally located in the area. You have the Caspian Sea, which all of a sudden means that there could be U.S. naval boats in here patrolling these waters. You have obviously the whole Persian Gulf could come under U.S. control, even though it largely already is. And you could see Russia losing a very, very strategically placed country in its kind of under its sphere of influence. So I think that's going to be really important. And then also China. But China is not as entrenched in the Middle East as the U.S. and Russia are. So time will tell. But they are making moves into the region, obviously with Djibouti and their new camp, or their new military base. So time will tell with them. But I guess for my final thoughts is something that I thought of while I was doing research for this presentation was this is very eerily similar to the unification of Germany by Bismarck. What I mean by that is if you look at a map of Europe, you'll see that Germany is very centrally located. They have water access, and they also have a lot of land access, and they're kind of right in the middle of everything going on in Europe. So anything that goes on in Europe will inevitably move through Germany. And so the reason why all of these other world powers didn't want a stable German state to come about, and why there was, Prussia and then I think even hundreds of smaller little federations and states, where modern day Germany is right now, they didn't want it to become unified because it would be too powerful to combat, and they would lose their grip on power. You have to think about everything in international relations and power politics. Now, power politics is politics based on the pursuit of power. I think everyone kind of knows, even if they don't know the specific term for it, everybody knows what that means. And that is the Cold War, for example, the U.S. was trying to have more power than the USSR. The USSR is trying to have more power than the U.S. You see it in China and the South China Sea versus America, and now you're seeing it in Iran. If Iran is to become, a beacon of power in the Middle East, all of a sudden that threatens Israel's dominance, threatens Saudi Arabia's dominance, it could threaten Pakistan and India's dominance. It would also threaten Turkey's and indirectly both the U.S. and Russia, and as well China. So I could see a calculation going on here where the U.S. sees the possibility of a strong Iranian state, possibly allied with Russia and China, as too much of a threat to let slide. So this is why I'm kind of pessimistic when it comes to, the conflict is over, Donald Trump solved it type of attitude. I don't think it's anywhere near that because, again, the momentum is building. America does not want this nation to fall on the wrong side, to be against it. So they will do whatever it takes, and it could be very, very, very gradual to make sure that this region does not fall into the wrong hands. So I want everyone to be thinking about that in terms of any world conflict, because the Middle East is going to be the focal point, because it has been the focal point of all conflicts for a very long time, probably about 30, 40 years. And Iran especially has been at the center of all of that. It basically, as basic as it is, just that it's just such a prime location. It's just a prime location. That's what I'm trying to say. And so the U.S. does not want it to be against them. Russia does not want it to be against them. China does not want it to be against them. It's just focus on that, realize that, and for so long there was all of these different conflicts going on in the Middle East, and no one ever brought up Iran until now, until the last 6 months, I would say. Very curious, in my opinion, and very interesting. But just keep an eye on that, because that seems to be the long game. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If there's anything that I got wrong, please put it down in the comments below. I will pin any corrections. So please let me know. I want to be as correct as possible. And if you know something I don't, or if I was wrong, please, please, please correct me. If you want to see any other videos, if you want to have a certain topic covered, let me know in the comments. I'll definitely do it. But I'm planning on gradually adding on to this. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. If you liked it, throw it a like. If you want to see more, subscribe, obviously. You can find all my social media in the description. All the sources, I will probably put this presentation as like a downloadable file on Google Drive or something like that. So, and all of the sources that I've used are embedded in that, because all the links are in it. So if you want to see what I was reading about and see the research I did, just go there. I don't think there's anything else. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you have a good rest of your day, night, weekend, week, whatever it is, whatever you're doing. Hope you do it well. Hope it's a good time. Yeah, stay informed. Watch the news, but not some news. And then, yeah, let me know if there's anything else you want me to see. I will see you guys in the next one. This has been a presentation by EpicurusZ.